The old upright piano in the corner of the apartment had seen better days. Several keys were yellowed with age, and a thin layer of dust covered its surface despite the boy's best efforts to keep it clean. But to the 12-year-old who sat before it now, fingers dancing across the keys in the early morning light, it was more precious than gold. Lee paused his playing and glanced at the clock on the wall. His mother would be waking soon, exhausted from her night shift at the hospital. He needed to practice as much as possible before then, but quietly enough not to disturb her much-needed rest. His slim fingers returned to the keys, pressing them with barely enough force to produce sound. The melody of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 whispered through the small apartment, each note carrying his dreams with it. In just 3 hours, he would face the most important moment of his young life, an audition at Westwood Music Academy. The prestigious school rarely accepted students without years of formal training, but his music teacher at school had insisted on submitting his application after hearing him play at the winter concert. "Talent like yours deserves the right environment to grow," she had told him, eyes bright with conviction. Lee wasn't so sure. Their neighborhood wasn't the kind that produced classical pianists. Most kids he knew had never even touched a piano. He'd started on a small keyboard his mother had found at a secondhand store 4 years ago, teaching himself through YouTube tutorials and free sheet music from the library. The upright piano had been a miraculous find, left behind by former tenants who couldn't afford to move it. The building manager had let them keep it, saying it would cost more to remove than it was worth. Lee. His mother's soft voice broke through his thoughts. He stopped playing immediately, turning to find her standing in the doorway, still wearing her nurse's scrubs. Her face looked tired, but her eyes held their usual warmth. "I'm sorry, Mom. Did I wake you?" he asked, guilt washing over him. She shook her head and came to sit beside him on the piano bench. "No, I was already up. You play so beautifully." She wrapped an arm around his shoulders and squeezed gently. "Are you nervous about today?" Lee nodded, unable to hide the truth from her. "What if I'm not good enough? Those other kids, they've probably been taking lessons since they could walk." His mother was quiet for a moment. Then she took his hands in hers, turning them palm up as if reading his fortune. "These hands," she said softly, "have worked harder than most. You've earned every note you play." She looked at him with fierce pride. "When you feel afraid today, remember that music speaks when words cannot. Your playing has heart, and that's something no amount of expensive lessons can teach." Lee leaned against her shoulder, drawing strength from her presence. "I'll remember." The journey to Westwood took nearly an hour by bus and subway. Lee clutched his folder of sheet music, carefully protected in plastic sleeves as they walked up the impressive stone steps of the academy. The building looked like something from another world, all gleaming windows and polished stone, with perfectly manicured gardens surrounding it. Students moved about with instrument cases, their confident voices filling the air. Lee felt his courage faltering with each step. His second-hand suit jacket, bought specially for this occasion, suddenly seemed shabby and obvious. His mother must have sensed his hesitation because she took his hand again. "Just for a moment. Remember what I said," she whispered before guiding him toward the reception desk. They were directed to wait outside Auditorium 3. Several other children sat with their parents, most clutching instruments or sheet music. One boy was quietly going through finger exercises on an invisible keyboard. A girl with perfectly braided hair was having her outfit adjusted by a woman who could only be her mother, the diamond ring on her finger catching the light with every movement. Lee sat very still, trying to make himself invisible. His mother had to leave for her second job. She couldn't afford to miss a shift, not even today, so he was alone among these strangers. The wait stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour. Li Jiao, a stern-looking woman with clipboard, appeared at the door. Lee stood quickly, almost dropping his folder. "Yes, that's me. You're next. Follow me, please." With one last glance at the exit, Lee followed her into the auditorium. The room was larger than he had imagined, with row upon row of empty seats facing a stage where a magnificent grand piano stood, its surface gleaming under the bright lights. Seated in the front row were 3 people, 2 women and a man, all with expressions of polite disinterest. The man in the center looked up as Lee approached. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to find every flaw in Lee's appearance. The nameplate on the table before him read, "Director Thomas Hargrove." Name? He asked, not bothering to check the paper in front of him. Li Jiao, sir. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Age? 12. And who is your instructor? Li hesitated. I don't have a formal instructor, sir. I'm mostly self-taught. This caught the director's attention. He looked up from his notes, eyebrows raised in what could only be described as disbelief. Self-taught? He exchanged glances with his colleagues. And what will you be playing for us today, Mr. Zhao? Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, sir. Now Director Hargrove's eyebrows nearly disappeared into his hairline. Ambitious choice for someone without formal training. His tone made it clear what he thought of Li's chances. Li swallowed hard and nodded. Very well. You may begin when ready. With shaking legs, Li walked to the piano. It was a Steinway concert grand, worth more than everything his family owned combined. He gently placed his sheet music on the stand, though he knew the piece by heart. Sitting on the bench, he took a moment to adjust its height. Behind him, he heard a sharp whisper that wasn't meant to be quiet. Another waste of my afternoon. Li's fingers froze above the keys. The director's words cut through him like ice, confirming every doubt he'd been fighting. He was an imposter here, a boy from nowhere with nothing but impossible dreams. A small commotion drew his attention. Director Hargrove had stood up, his patience clearly at an end. Let's not waste any more time, he announced to his colleagues. If this boy plays the piano at the level required for Westwood, I'll kneel right here on this floor. He gestured dramatically to the polished wood beneath his expensive shoes, his voice dripping with mockery. The woman to his right looked uncomfortable. Thomas, please. But the director had already folded his arms, waiting for the inevitable disappointment. The message was clear. Li didn't belong here. For a moment, Li considered walking away. It would be easier than facing the humiliation that surely awaited him. But then his mother's words came back to him. Music speaks when words cannot. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and remembered why he played. Not for people like Director Hargrove, but for the pure joy that music brought him. For his mother, who worked 2 jobs so he could have opportunities she never had. For himself and the dream that had carried him this far. With newfound resolve, Li opened his eyes, positioned his fingers over the keys, and began to play. The first notes filled the auditorium, soft and hesitant like raindrops before a storm. Li's fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that belied the turmoil inside him. He kept his eyes on the piano, avoiding the judgmental stare of Director Hargrove. For the opening measures, his playing was technically correct but restrained. The weight of the moment, this chance that might never come again, pressed down on his shoulders. The grand piano responded to his touch differently than his old upright at home. It was more sensitive, more alive, revealing both the beauty of the music and any flaws in his technique. From the corner of his eye, Li could see Director Hargrove checking his watch. The woman beside him was taking notes, her pen moving quickly across the page. The third judge stared out the window, apparently bored already. Then something shifted inside Li. Maybe it was remembering his mother's early mornings and late nights, the way she'd stand in the doorway of their apartment sometimes, listening to him play with tired eyes that somehow still shone with pride. Maybe it was thinking of the hours he'd spent hunched over their second-hand piano, replaying the same passages until his fingers ached and his back cramped. Or maybe it was simply the music itself, finally breaking through his fear. Whatever the reason, Li stopped playing to impress the judges. He began playing for himself. His posture changed, his shoulders relaxing as he leaned into the music. His touch became more confident, the notes ringing clear and true through the hall. The ballad began to take shape not as isolated notes on a page, but as a living thing with breath and pulse. In the front row, Director Hargrove's pen stopped moving mid-note. He looked up, his expression changing from dismissive to confused. Li was unaware of this shift. He had entered that rare space where the player and the music become one thing. His small hand stretched to reach difficult chords, somehow finding the strength to bring out the melody while keeping the accompaniment balanced underneath. The moderate opening section gave way to the more intense passages, his left hand providing a steady foundation, while his right hand sang the haunting theme. The judges stopped shuffling papers. The woman who had been taking notes placed her pen down. Even the custodian who had been quietly mopping the back of the hall paused his work, leaning on his mop as he listened. Lee's body swayed slightly with the rhythm, the melody pulling him forward and back like a tide. His face, previously tight with anxiety, had softened. There was still concentration there, but also joy, the pure pleasure of bringing something beautiful into the world. As the piece progressed, growing more complex, Lee's technical mastery became increasingly apparent. The runs and trills that had intimidated him during practice now flowed from his fingers as naturally as speech. When he reached the challenging waltz section, he didn't hesitate or slow down. His timing remained perfect, his touch delicate yet precise. Director Hargrove leaned forward in his chair, his earlier skepticism replaced by something close to wonder. The woman beside him had closed her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. Outside the auditorium, other students waiting for their turn pressed their ears against the door, drawn by the music floating through the cracks. A few teachers passing by in the hallway stopped to listen, exchanging impressed glances. Inside, Lee had forgotten everything but the piano beneath his hands. The world had narrowed to just this: the keys, the sound, the feeling of being carried along by something greater than himself. When he reached the thunderous climax of the piece, his small frame somehow found the power to make the grand piano sing at full voice without harshness or banging. The final section approached, the most technically demanding part of the entire piece. Notes cascaded like waterfalls, requiring not just finger strength but absolute control. Many seasoned pianists struggled with this coda, its rapid-fire octaves and leaps challenging even for adult hands. Lee took a deep breath, letting the music carry him forward. His fingers flew across the keyboard in perfect coordination, each note distinct yet part of the greater whole. The piece built toward its conclusion, tension mounting with each measure. In the front row, Director Hargrove was no longer sitting back with arms crossed. He had moved to the edge of his seat, hands gripping his knees, eyes wide with disbelief. The other judges looked equally stunned. With a final burst of energy, Lee brought the piece to its thunderous conclusion. The last chord rang through the auditorium, powerful and resolute. Then silence, complete and absolute, filled the space where music had been. Lee sat motionless at the piano, his hands still hovering above the keys, his breath coming in small gasps. Slowly, as if waking from a dream, he became aware of his surroundings again, the bright lights, the judges, the enormity of what had just happened. He turned hesitantly toward the panel, preparing himself for criticism or, at best, polite acknowledgement. What he saw instead made his heart stop. Director Hargrove was standing. Without a word, his face displaying a mixture of emotions Lee couldn't fully comprehend, the director slowly, deliberately lowered himself to one knee on the polished wooden floor. The woman beside him gasped softly. The third judge's mouth fell open in shock. "Sir?" Lee's voice came out as barely a whisper. Director Hargrove remained kneeling for a long moment, his head bowed. When he finally looked up, Lee was startled to see that the man's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Young man," the director said, his voice rougher than before, "where did you learn to play like that?" Lee blinked, unsure how to respond. "At home, sir. On our old piano. And your teacher? Who taught you to interpret Chopin with such understanding?" Lee shifted uncomfortably on the bench. "I watched videos online, sir, and I listened to recordings. My school doesn't have a music program anymore, so I couldn't take lessons there." The director rose slowly to his feet, brushing off his knee with one hand while keeping his eyes fixed on Lee. "No formal training at all? No private instructor?" "No, sir. We couldn't—" Lee stopped himself before saying they couldn't afford it. "I learned on my own." Director Hargrove turned to his colleagues, who appeared equally moved. They exchanged glances filled with meaning before the director approached the piano. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bench. Lee quickly stood and moved aside. The director sat down, his long fingers resting lightly on the keys without pressing them. "I've been teaching music for 35 years, he said quietly. "I've judged competitions across 4 continents. I've heard some of the finest young pianists in the world." He looked up at Lee. "But I have never heard anyone your age play with the soul you just demonstrated." Lee felt heat rise to his cheeks. "Thank you, sir." "No." Director Hargrove shook his head firmly. "Thank you. You've reminded an old cynic of something important today." He rose from the bench and extended his hand. Music isn't about pedigree or privilege. It's about passion and perseverance. Lee stared at the offered hand for a moment before shaking it, still struggling to process what was happening. Ms. Chen, the director called to the woman judge, please make a note that we'll need to create a special scholarship category. He turned back to Lee. That is, if you'd be interested in studying at Westwood? Lee's mouth opened and closed several times before he could form words. Yes, sir. Very much. Good. Director Hargrove nodded decisively. Because I think we have as much to learn from you as you from us. The third judge had approached now. Thomas, the board hasn't approved any new scholarships for this year. The budget is already— I'll fund it myself if necessary, Director Hargrove cut in. Talent like this comes along once in a generation, if we're lucky. He looked at Lee with new eyes, not seeing the second-hand clothes or the lack of formal training, but the dedication and heart that had produced such music. We'd be fools to let it slip away. Lee stood frozen, unable to fully comprehend the turn of events. Just minutes ago, this man had practically laughed him out of the room. Now he was offering a scholarship? I should warn you, the director continued, a hint of his earlier sternness returning, that Westwood demands excellence. You'll work harder than you ever have before. There will be theory classes, history, composition, not just performance. Lee nodded solemnly. I'm not afraid of hard work, sir. For the first time, Director Hargrove smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his severe face. No, I don't believe you are. He glanced at his watch. Do you have a parent or guardian with you today? There's paperwork to discuss. Lee's smile faltered. My mother had to go to work. She's a nurse at County Hospital. I see. The director considered this. Well, we'll arrange another time to meet with her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Have her call my office directly. Not the admissions department. Lee took the card with careful fingers as if it might dissolve into dust at any moment. Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say. Director Hargrove's expression softened further. Say you'll practice. Say you'll never lose that fire I heard today. He placed a hand briefly on Lee's shoulder. The technical aspects we can teach you, but that heart, that understanding of the music, that comes from somewhere else entirely. As Lee gathered his sheet music with trembling hands, he could hardly believe what had just happened. He'd come to Westwood expecting rejection. Instead, he was leaving with a future he'd barely dared to dream of. The first person he needed to tell was his mother. She'd been right all along. Music truly did speak when words could not. Lee clutched the business card tightly as he rode the bus home, reading Director Hargrove's name and contact information over and over, to convince himself that the afternoon had actually happened. The other passengers paid no attention to the small boy in the second-hand suit, unaware that his life had just changed forever. He reached for his phone, a basic model his mother had given him for emergencies, and dialed her number. It went straight to voicemail. She was probably busy with patients, her phone tucked away in her locker during her shift. The news would have to wait. As the bus rumbled through the city, Lee gazed out the window at the passing buildings. Everything looked exactly the same as it had this morning, yet somehow completely different. The weight that had pressed on his chest for weeks leading up to the audition had lifted, replaced by a strange, buoyant feeling he couldn't quite name. When he finally reached their apartment building, he took the stairs two at a time, his sheet music folder swinging wildly in his hand. He burst through the door, half hoping his mother might have come home early, but the apartment was empty and quiet. Lee placed his folder carefully on the table and walked to the old upright piano in the corner. He ran his fingers gently across its worn keys, remembering how different the Academy's grand piano had felt beneath his hands. The contrast between that gleaming instrument and this tired old piano struck him anew. Yet this was where his journey had begun, on these yellowed keys, with their slightly uneven action and occasional sticky notes. He sat down and began to play, not Chopin this time, but a simple melody his mother loved, a folk song from her childhood in China. The notes filled their small apartment, bouncing off the thin walls and worn furniture. There was a richness to his playing now, a confidence that hadn't been there before. Today's experience had changed something fundamental in him. Hours passed as Lee played through his repertoire, losing himself in the music. When the door finally opened just after 9 o'clock, he jumped up from the bench. Mom, she looked exhausted. Her nurse's uniform wrinkled from a long day on her feet, dark circles under her eyes, but her face brightened at the sight of him. "Lee, how did it go?" She set down her bag and walked toward him, hope and worry mingling in her expression. For a moment, Lee couldn't speak. The emotions of the day crashed over him suddenly, and to his embarrassment, tears filled his eyes. His mother's face fell. "Oh, Lee," she said softly, reaching for him. "It's okay. There will be other chances." "No, Mom," he interrupted, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I got in." "I got in." She froze. "What?" "I got in. Director Hargrove, he said I played with soul. He said he'd never heard anyone my age play like that. He's creating a special scholarship for me." The words tumbled out in a rush. "He knelt down, Mom. He actually knelt down on the floor after I played." His mother's eyes widened. "He knelt?" "The director?" Lee nodded, pulling the business card from his pocket. "He gave me this. He wants you to call him to discuss the paperwork." He pressed the card into her hand. "He said I have a gift, that they'd be fools to let me slip away." His mother stared at the card, then at Lee, her expression shifting from disbelief to joy. Suddenly, she pulled him into a fierce hug, lifting him slightly off the ground despite her small frame. "I knew it," she whispered against his hair. "I always knew you were special." When she finally set him down, there were tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling wider than Lee had ever seen. "We have to celebrate," she declared, wiping her cheeks. "I'll make your favorite dumplings tomorrow. And tonight," she glanced at the clock, "ice cream." "It's not too late for ice cream." Lee laughed, the sound bursting from him like music. "It's never too late for ice cream." They sat at their small kitchen table with bowls of the inexpensive vanilla ice cream his mother had pulled from the freezer, topped with the chocolate sauce she kept hidden for special occasions. As they ate, Lee described every detail of the audition. The grand piano, the judges' faces, the moment when Director Hargrove had knelt on the polished floor. "I was so scared at first," Lee admitted. "He was so cold, like he'd already decided I wasn't good enough before I played a single note." His mother reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "But you showed him." "You let your music speak," Lee nodded. "I thought about what you said, and then I just played." He struggled to find the right words. It was like I wasn't even thinking anymore. The music was just happening. "That's when you know it's real," his mother said softly. "When it comes from your heart, not just your head." She looked at the business card on the table between them. "So what happens next?" Lee's excitement dimmed slightly as reality set in. "There's the scholarship for tuition, but there will be other costs. Books, proper clothes, maybe a better instrument eventually." His mother's face grew serious, but her eyes remained determined. "We will find a way. I can pick up extra shifts at the hospital. Maybe Dr. Reynolds will let me help with his research project. He mentioned needing an assistant." "Mom, you already work so much," Lee protested. "This is important," she said firmly. "This is your future." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "When your father and I came to this country, we had dreams. Big dreams. Life didn't turn out exactly as we planned, but—" She turned back to him. "Maybe our dreams just needed a little more time. Maybe they were waiting for you." Lee felt the weight of her hopes on his shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. It was a gift, her belief in him, the sacrifices she'd made, the ones she was still willing to make. "I won't let you down," he promised. His mother came back to the table and cupped his face in her hands. "You could never let me down. I'm already so proud of you. Not because you got into a fancy school, but because of who you are. Your kindness, your determination, the way you never give up," she smiled. "The scholarship is just the world finally seeing what I've always known." The next morning, Lee woke to the sound of his mother's voice. She was in the kitchen, speaking in hushed, excited tones. It took him a moment to realize she was on the phone, with Director Hargrove. He got out of bed quietly and stood in the hallway, listening. "Yes, I understand," his mother was saying. "The orientation is next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. We'll be there." A pause. "No, that won't be a problem. I can adjust my shifts," and another pause, longer this time. "That's very generous of you, Director Hargrove, but—" She stopped, apparently interrupted. "I see. Well, if you're sure it's not special treatment—" Her voice wavered slightly. "Thank you. This means everything to him, to us." When she hung up, Lee stepped into the kitchen. What did he say? His mother turned, her eyes bright with excitement. You start next week. There's an orientation on Tuesday, and then classes begin the following Monday. She took a deep breath. And he's arranged for transportation. A school van will pick you up and bring you home each day. Lee's eyes widened. Really? But we live so far from the academy. He said distance shouldn't be a barrier to talent. She smiled.
And there's more.
They're starting a community outreach program, bringing music education to underserved schools. They want to use some of their endowment to restore music programs that have been cut. She reached for his hand. Director Hargrove said your audition was a wake-up call, that there must be other talented young musicians out there who simply lack opportunity. Lee could hardly believe what he was hearing. His simple audition had sparked something larger than himself. There's one more thing, his mother said, her voice growing serious. The academy has a concert hall. Each year they showcase their most promising students. Director Hargrove wants you to perform in the winter showcase. Lee felt a flutter of panic. But that's only a few months away. The other students have been training for years. He believes in you, his mother said simply. And so do I. In the days that followed, their small apartment became a flurry of activity. His mother took him shopping for new clothes. Nothing fancy, but clean and proper for his new school. She called relatives to share the news, her voice filled with pride as she recounted the story of the director kneeling in awe. Lee practiced more intensely than ever, knowing that at Westwood he would be surrounded by students who had advantages he'd never had. The night before orientation, Lee couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with a mixture of excitement and fear. What if yesterday had been a fluke? What if he couldn't keep up with the other students? What if he disappointed everyone, his mother, Director Hargrove, himself? Just before dawn, he gave up on sleep and crept to the piano. In the gray morning light, he began to play. Softly at first, then with growing confidence. The music flowed from him, clear and true, chasing away his doubts like sunshine dispelling shadows. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them the same way he'd faced that grand piano in the auditorium, one note at a time with all his heart. From her bedroom, his mother listened, a smile on her tired face. Tomorrow would bring change, challenges, a new world opening before them. But for now, there was just this, her son and his music, filling their humble home with beauty that transcended their circumstances. The Westwood Music Academy looked even more imposing on orientation day. Lee and his mother stood at the bottom of the stone steps, taking in the magnificent building with its tall windows and ivy-covered walls. Students and parents streamed past them, many dressed in clothes that probably cost more than everything in Lee's closet combined. Ready? His mother asked, squeezing his hand. Lee nodded, though his stomach was doing flips. He straightened the collar of his new button-up shirt, the nicest one he'd ever owned, and took the first step. Inside, the main hall buzzed with activity. Tables were set up with information about different programs, extracurricular activities, and parent committees. Staff members in formal attire directed families to various presentations. Everything gleamed. The polished floors, the brass fixtures, the glass display cases showing off trophies and awards. Lee felt like an imposter, as if at any moment someone would point at him and shout that he didn't belong. His mother must have sensed his discomfort because she leaned down and whispered, "Remember why you're here. Your music earned you this place." Before Lee could respond, a familiar voice called out, "Ah, Mr. Zhao, and this must be your mother." Director Hargrove approached them looking quite different from the stern judge Lee had faced at the audition. Today he wore a more relaxed expression, his eyes warm as he extended his hand to Lee's mother. "Mrs. Zhao, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your son has an extraordinary gift." Lee's mother shook the director's hand, her posture straightening with pride. "Thank you for giving him this opportunity, Director Hargrove." "The opportunity is ours," he replied, surprising Lee with his sincerity. "Now let me introduce you to some key people." What followed was a whirlwind of introductions. Faculty members, administrative staff, and program coordinators. Everyone seemed genuinely interested in Lee, asking about his musical background and expressing amazement when they learned he was largely self-taught. "This is Ms. Rivera," Director Hargrove said, introducing them to a tall woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. "She'll be Lee's primary piano instructor." Ms. Rivera smiled warmly at Lee. Director Hargrove has told me all about your audition. I'm looking forward to working with you. Lee's nervousness eased slightly. Ms. Rivera didn't seem intimidating like he'd feared his teachers might be. And this, Director Hargrove continued, guiding them toward a boy about Lee's age who stood by the refreshment table, is Wu, one of our most promising young pianists. He'll be showing Lee around campus today. Wu was taller than Lee, with wire-rimmed glasses and a confident smile. He extended his hand formally like a miniature adult. Nice to meet you. Director Hargrove says you played Chopin's Ballad No. 1 at your audition. That's impressive. Lee shook his hand, surprised by the friendly greeting. Thanks. I've been working on it for a long time. Cool. Want to see the practice rooms? They're the best part of this place. With a quick glance at his mother, who nodded encouragingly, Lee followed Wu down a corridor while Director Hargrove continued his conversation with Lee's mother. So you taught yourself? Wu asked as they walked. Like no teacher at all? Pretty much. I watched a lot of videos online, and I listened to recordings trying to figure out how the great pianist did it. Wu shook his head in amazement. That's wild. I've had lessons since I was 4. My parents hired a teacher who studied at Juilliard. He pushed open a door, revealing a hallway lined with small rooms, each containing a piano. These are the practice rooms. Students can reserve them anytime between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Lee peered into one of the rooms. The piano inside wasn't as grand as the one in the auditorium, but it was still nicer than anything he'd ever played on regularly. We get assessed every month, Wu continued as they walked. It's pretty intense. Some kids crack under the pressure. He glanced at Lee. But Hargrove must think you're special if he created a scholarship just for you. Lee wasn't sure how to respond to that. I just love playing, he said simply. Wu studied him for a moment, then smiled. Yeah, me too. That's what matters in the end, right? Come on, I'll show you the library next. They have recordings of every major piano competition for the past 50 years. By the time they rejoined the adults, Lee's head was spinning with information, course requirements, practice schedules, performance opportunities, theory classes, but his initial fear had been replaced by excitement. This was a world built around music, his world. Director Hargrove was still talking with Lee's mother, their conversation seeming more serious now. The Winter Showcase is our most important event of the year, he was saying. Donors, music critics, representatives from conservatories and universities, they all attend. It's a tremendous opportunity for exposure. Lee's mother nodded. Lee will be ready, I have no doubt, but it will require intense preparation. The director turned to Lee. How was your tour? Amazing, Lee replied honestly. I've never seen so many pianos in one place. Director Hargrove laughed. Well, you'll have access to all of them now. Speaking of which, he pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to Lee's mother. This is part of our new community outreach initiative. A stipend to help with additional expenses, music books, appropriate attire for performances, and eventually, perhaps, a better instrument for home practice. Lee's mother started to protest, but Director Hargrove held up his hand. It's not charity, Mrs. Zhao. It's an investment in talent. We've been remiss in not doing this sooner. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted the envelope with a grateful nod. As they left the academy that afternoon, Lee felt both exhausted and exhilarated. The school van dropped them off at their apartment building, and as they climbed the familiar stairs, the contrast between Westwood's polished elegance and their humble home struck Lee anew. What are you thinking? His mother asked as she unlocked their door. Lee paused before answering. That everything's changing so fast. His mother smiled, touching his cheek gently. Some things won't change. Who we are, where we came from. She stepped into their apartment. The important things stay the same. The days that followed brought a new rhythm to their lives. Each morning, the school van picked Lee up at 7 o'clock sharp. His days were filled with classes, not just piano lessons with Ms. Rivera, but music theory, composition, history, and ensemble work. Every evening he returned home exhausted but buzzing with new knowledge. Ms. Rivera proved to be exactly what Lee needed, strict but kind, pushing him to refine his technique without dampening his natural expressiveness. You have remarkable instincts, she told him during their third lesson. But instinct alone isn't enough for the path you're on. We need to build a solid technical foundation. She worked with him on hand position, on the subtle weight transfers that produce different tones, on pedaling techniques he'd never considered. Sometimes the lessons were frustrating, having to unlearn habits he'd developed on his own, but Lee never complained. Every correction brought him closer to the musician he wanted to become. At home, he practiced on their old upright with renewed purpose. His mother often stood in the doorway listening, marvel on her face as she heard the transformation in his playing. "It's like watching a butterfly emerge," she said one evening. "I can hear how much you're learning." The winter showcase loomed closer. Director Hargrove had selected Lee to close the program, the most prestigious spot. The pressure was enormous, but Lee channeled it into his practice. For the showcase, he would play the same piece from his audition, Chopin's Ballade No. 1, but Miss Rivera was helping him elevate it to a new level. "Let's make them forget they ever heard another version," she said with a mischievous smile during one of their sessions. "Let's make them feel the music in their bones." With each passing week, Lee grew more confident, not just at the piano, but in navigating Westwood itself. He'd made friends beyond Wu. There was Tai, a violinist with quick wit and quicker fingers. Zora, who played cello with such passion it sometimes brought tears to listeners' eyes. And Raj, whose composing skills had already won national recognition. They were all prodigies in their own ways, but none of them made Lee feel lesser for his unconventional background. If anything, they seemed to respect him more for it. "You had to work twice as hard to get here," Zora told him once during lunch. "That counts for something." 2 weeks before the showcase, Director Hargrove pulled Lee aside after his lesson with Ms. Rivera. "I have a surprise for you," he said, guiding Lee to a small storage room near the main office. He unlocked the door and switched on the light, revealing a baby grand piano, not brand new but well-maintained, its black surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "This was donated by an alumnus years ago," Director Hargrove explained. "It's been sitting here, barely used. I thought perhaps it might serve a better purpose in your home." He ran his hand along the polished wood. "It's not a Steinway, but it's a solid instrument. Better than an upright for the level you're reaching." Lee stared at the piano, speechless. "We can arrange delivery this weekend if that works for your mother," the director continued. "Consider it part of your scholarship package." Finally finding his voice, Lee whispered, "I don't know what to say." Director Hargrove smiled, a genuine smile that softened his usually serious face. "Say you'll make it sing, that's all I ask." When the piano arrived at their apartment that Saturday, Lee's mother wept. The delivery men had to rearrange their entire living room to make it fit, moving the sofa against the wall and relocating the small dining table to the kitchen. But when they left and Lee sat down to play for the first time, the rich, resonant sound filling every corner of their small home, his mother's tears turned to laughter. "Now the neighbors will really have something to complain about," she joked, wiping her eyes, but the neighbors didn't complain. Instead, they began to gather in the hallway outside the Jouses' apartment in the evenings, listening silently as Lee practiced. Sometimes when he finished, he would hear soft applause through the door. The night before the showcase, Lee couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing through the piece, imagining his fingers on the keys, hearing the music in his head. Finally, he slipped out of bed and padded to the living room. In the moonlight streaming through the window, the baby grand looked almost magical, a dark, sleek shape promising worlds of sound. Lee sat on the bench but didn't play. Instead, he simply rested his hands on the cool keys, feeling their smooth surfaces beneath his fingertips. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, "I play for everyone who believed in me." The day of the winter showcase arrived with a light snowfall that dusted Westwood's campus in white. Lee stood at the window of a practice room, watching snowflakes drift past the glass while his fingers moved silently through the motions of Chopin's Ballade on the wooden sill. In just a few hours, he would perform for the most important audience of his young life. "There you are," said a voice behind him. Lee turned to see Ms. Rivera in the doorway, elegant in a long black dress, her silver-streaked hair arranged in an intricate updo. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Lee admitted, "but ready, I think." She smiled, coming to stand beside him at the window. "Nerves are good. They mean you care." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I want to tell you something before tonight. When Director Hargrove first told me about you, about the boy who played Chopin so beautifully that he knelt on the floor, I was skeptical." Lee looked up at her, surprised by this confession. In my 30 years of teaching, I've seen many prodigies come and go. Technical brilliance is rare but not unique. Her eyes held his. What is unique, what I've discovered in you these past weeks, is something beyond technique. It's an understanding of the music, a connection to its heart. That can't be taught, Lee. It's a gift. Lee felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. Tonight, when you walk onto that stage, remember that. You belong there. She straightened his collar slightly. Now go find your mother. She's probably worried sick in the waiting area. I'll see you backstage in an hour. Lee nodded, grateful for her confidence in him. As he made his way through the academy's corridors, now familiar after weeks of classes, he felt a curious calm settling over him. The initial panic had given way to a focused energy, a readiness to share what he loved most. He found his mother in the reception area, pacing nervously. She wore her best dress, a simple blue one she usually saved for special occasions, and had styled her hair differently. When she saw him, relief washed over her face. There you are. I was beginning to think you'd run away. She smoothed his already smooth jacket, a mother's instinctive gesture. How are you feeling? Better now, he said honestly. Ms. Rivera just gave me a pep talk. His mother smiled. She's been good for you. I can hear it in your playing. They sat together in a quiet corner, away from the growing crowd of well-dressed families arriving for the showcase. His mother reached into her purse and pulled out a small red envelope. This is for you, she said, pressing it into his hands. A tradition from home. For luck. Lee opened it carefully. Inside was a small jade pendant on a red cord, a simple design of a circle within a circle. It was your grandfather's, she explained as she helped him tie it around his wrist. He wore it when he gave his first concert as a young man, before the Cultural Revolution changed everything. She touched the pendant gently. He never got to pursue his music fully, but he never lost his love for it either. When you were born, he said you had musician's hands. Her eyes glistened. He would be so proud to see you tonight. Lee stared at the pendant, feeling a connection to a grandfather he'd barely known, and a musical legacy he was only beginning to understand. I wish he could be here. He is, his mother said simply, touching his heart. In the most important way. An announcement called for all performers to gather backstage. Lee hugged his mother tightly before joining the flow of young musicians heading toward the concert hall. Backstage was a flurry of activity, students tuning instruments, adjusting formal wear, practicing last-minute passages under their breath. Lee found a quiet corner and closed his eyes, mentally walking through his piece one final time. The showcase began promptly at 7. From behind the curtain, Lee could hear the murmur of a full house. He peeked through a small gap and felt his stomach tighten at the sight of the packed auditorium. Row upon row of faces, all soon to be focused on him. One by one, his fellow students took the stage. First came the younger children, a charming ensemble of beginning violinists playing a simple folk tune with earnest concentration. Then older students, a flautist whose tone was pure as crystal, a string quartet tackling a challenging Beethoven movement, a young vocalist whose operatic aria brought spontaneous applause before she'd even finished. Wu performed a technically brilliant Liszt piece, his fingers flying across the keys with precision that earned him enthusiastic applause. Zora's cello solo was so emotionally charged that Lee saw audience members wiping away tears. Tay's violin sang like a human voice, telling stories without words. Each performance was exceptional, showcasing the remarkable talent gathered at Westwood. With every act, Lee felt the bar rising higher. As the final student before him left the stage to warm applause, his nerves returned full force. "You're up, Lee," whispered a stagehand, gesturing toward the curtain. Lee took a deep breath, touched the jade pendant at his wrist, and walked onto the stage. The spotlight was blinding at first. He could barely make out faces in the audience, just a sea of shadowy figures. As his eyes adjusted, he spotted his mother in the third row, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her sat Director Hargrove, his expression attentive and expectant. Lee approached the gleaming grand piano centered on the stage, the same one from his audition months ago. He adjusted the bench, placed his hands in his lap, and took one final centering breath. Then he began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's ballad filled the concert hall, gentle yet purposeful. Lee felt the familiar sensation of being both utterly present and somehow outside himself. Watching his fingers find each note with assured precision, As the piece progressed, he drew on everything Ms. Rivera had taught him: the subtle dynamics, the balance between voices, the architectural structure of the music. But he also reached beyond technique to the emotional core of the piece, to the story it was telling. Under his hands, the piano became a vessel for something larger than himself. He was no longer playing just for the audience, or for his teachers, or even for his mother. He was playing for the music itself, for what it meant, for what it could be. When he reached the waltz section, his body swayed slightly with the rhythm, the melody dancing above the steady accompaniment. Each phrase led naturally to the next, building toward the climactic moments with a sense of inevitability. The more challenging passages, the ones he'd struggled with for months, now flowed from his fingers as if they'd always been there, waiting to be discovered. In the audience, Director Hargrove leaned forward in his seat, his eyes never leaving Lee's hands. Beside him, Lee's mother watched with quiet pride, occasionally exchanging glances with the director as if to say, "Do you see? Do you see what he can do?" As Lee approached the final section of the piece, the virtuosic coda that had once seemed impossibly difficult, time seemed to slow. Each note rang clear and true in the perfect acoustics of the hall. His small hands stretched to reach challenging intervals, finding strength he hadn't known he possessed. The final chords resonated through the space, powerful and conclusive. Lee held the last notes, letting them fade naturally into silence. For a moment he remained perfectly still, his hands hovering above the keys, reluctant to break the spell. Then slowly, he lowered his hands to his lap and raised his head. The audience erupted. The applause was immediate and overwhelming, not the polite appreciation offered to the other performers, but a genuine outpouring of emotion. People rose to their feet, their faces alight with wonder and joy. In the third row, Lee's mother was crying openly, her hands pressed to her heart. And beside her, true to the moment that had started it all, Director Hargrove had risen from his seat and dropped to one knee in the aisle, his head bowed in a gesture of profound respect. Lee blinked back tears as he stood to take his bow. The standing ovation continued, washing over him in waves. He spotted Wu in the wings, grinning and giving him a thumbs up. Ms. Rivera stood nearby, her hands clasped over her mouth, eyes shining with pride. When he finally left the stage, Director Hargrove was waiting in the wings. Without a word, the older man embraced him, a gesture that would have seemed impossible just months ago. "That," the director said when he finally stepped back, "is why I love music. Thank you for reminding me." After the showcase, the reception hall buzzed with energy. Lee found himself surrounded by well-wishers, faculty members, fellow students, even music critics eager to learn more about the remarkable young pianist who had closed the program. "Lee." His mother's voice cut through the crowd. She made her way to him, followed by a distinguished-looking man in a tailored suit. "This is Mr. Tanaka," she explained, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. "He's from the National Conservatory." The man extended his hand to Lee. "That was an extraordinary performance, young man. We have a summer program for exceptional talents. Full scholarship, of course. Director Hargrove tells me you might be interested." Lee looked from Mr. Tanaka to his mother, who nodded encouragingly to Director Hargrove, who stood nearby with a satisfied smile. "I would be honored," Lee said, shaking the man's hand. Later that night, after the crowds had dispersed and the concert hall stood empty, Lee sat alone at the piano one last time. The building was quiet except for the distant sound of cleaning staff preparing for tomorrow. He played a simple melody, the Chinese folk song his mother loved, the one his grandfather had taught her. The notes floated in the darkness, a bridge between past and future. From the back of the hall, unseen, Director Hargrove listened. He had come to lock up but paused at the sound. The music was different from the technical brilliance Lee had displayed earlier, simpler yet somehow more intimate. It spoke of home, of heritage, of the journey that had brought a remarkable young boy to this stage. Silently, the director slipped away, leaving Lee to his music. In the morning, there would be new plans to discuss: the summer program, a potential recording, the community outreach initiative inspired by Lee's story. But tonight there was just this: a boy and a piano in the quiet,